The committee will please take seats. While people are taking their seats, I want to announce that we expect a series of votes. It is our hope that we will complete this panel by the time we leave for the votes. If we do, then we will pick up the next panel afterwards. I must also announce for members that by agreement with the minority, there will be concurrent full committee and subcommittee hearings. So it's your responsibility to go back and forth, and we will accommodate people as they come in to take care of that. With that, we go to Mr. DeSantis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for your time. You know, as I've been sitting here through this whole ordeal, one consistent theme has been the refusal of higher-ups in the IRS to take any responsibility for the malfeasance within the agency. We had Douglas Shulman testify in front of this committee, and he said that while this impropriety happened on his watch, that he was not in fact responsible, even though he was the IRS commissioner at the time. Lois Lerner, of course, famously blamed rogue agents in Cincinnati for illicit targeting. Even the White House press secretary, Jay Carney, falsely claimed that political targeting was perpetrated by line personnel in Cincinnati. As the witnesses have explained today, the lack of response by the IRS to applications for tax-exempt status effectively froze these Tea Party groups in place and was even worse than a denial because the groups could not appeal a non-decision. And so I think it had a very tangible effect on these groups' ability to organize. But as I go through this, I keep coming back to Lois Lerner and her role in all this. It seems to me that she's left behind a trail of misinformation and obfuscation. As the testimony demonstrated today, Lerner deliberately misled the public and the Congress by blaming rogue agents in Cincinnati for something that she knew was being orchestrated from Washington, D.C. And as the witness testified, this was akin to a nuclear strike against employees in Cincinnati. They were the ones that she wanted to throw under the bus. No responsibility for her. Blame people beneath you who may not be able to defend themselves effectively. And even worse than that, she tried to cloak the illicit targeting that she knew about by ordering that employees use, quote, advocacy groups, a neutral sounding term, in lieu of, quote, Tea Party, which of course denotes a conservative group. And I just found it interesting that as a couple years ago was reported that she referred to thick IRS questionnaires, those being sent to somebody, as being, quote, behavior changers. Some of us would think that that would constitute harassment if it's being illicitly done, but for her it's a behavior changer. So I think Lois Lerner needs an answer for her behavior. This committee found that she waived her Fifth Amendment rights when she testified in front of the committee. I think she should be required to testify. As we get more and more information, it's becoming increasingly clear to me that if there were any, quote, rogue agents during this ordeal, that rogue agent was Lois Lerner. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Would the gentleman yield to me?
Yes, sir.
I want to take a point of privilege for a moment. Earlier, like many people from the chair, you say something and you take a shortcut. And I want to make sure I make something very clear. When I referred to my ranking member, who when we're not sparring over politics, he and I work very well together, I talked about effectively me thinks she does protest too much as we debate the question of whether things not being rogue agents in Cincinnati, but rather being in Washington at various levels that we're discussing here today, which include the office of the counsel and Lois Lerner. And I've been offended by my ranking member wanting to defend the White House, who I have not accused. But I took a shortcut in how I expressed it. I want to make it very clear that when I talk about the little boy putting his hand in the cookie jar, I'm talking about what cookie jar, what hand. And that is something that I grew up with. It is intended to be about a small child, and in no way the use of boy or little boy to be anything else. The ranking member and I enjoy a personal relationship that is, by definition, strained because of our jobs, but not because of how we respect each other. So, Mr. Cummings, I want to make it very, very clear that that difference of opinion should always be expressed in a way that you understand that you and I disagree sometimes about policies, but never about our individual roles. And I want to make sure that's clear, because the press, I think, took the use of little boy in a way that would certainly never come out of my thought, much less deliberately out of my mouth. And to the extent that anyone gets offended, Mr. Cummings, I certainly do not want it to be you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I really do appreciate your words. Words can certainly be taken out of context and taken and twisted and whatever, but I do appreciate it, and I know you mean that. Like you said, we differ sometimes on our views, but at the end of the day, the respect level is still extremely high, and so I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings. I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, has the full 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for not only their stamina, but also for what I call very careful, analytical, and professional way in which they have responded to many highly subjective questions. And so I appreciate both your long service to the agency as well as your professionalism. Yesterday, the Principal Deputy Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, Danny Werfel, testified before this committee that progressive groups received treatment from the IRS that was similar to Tea Party groups when they applied for tax-exempt status. In fact, Congressman Sander Levin, who is the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, explained these similarities in more detail. He said the IRS took years to resolve these cases, just like the Tea Party cases. And he said the IRS, one, screened for these groups, transferred them to the exempt organization's technical unit, made them the subject of a sensitive case report, and had them reviewed by the Office of Chief Counsel. According to the information provided to the Committee on Ways and Means, some of these progressive groups actually had their applications denied after a 3-year wait. And the resolution of these cases happened during the time period that the Inspector General reviewed for its audit. Unfortunately, because the Inspector General objected to the release of this information to the public, I can only ask you about these groups only in a vague manner. Ms. Holt-Aker, were you aware of the existence of any groupings of progressive organizations within the determinations unit?
Sir, when I was involved in the project in 2010, I was not aware of any such grouping.
Were you aware of how these cases were being processed?
In 2010, no, I do not have any awareness of how they were being processed.
Did you know that they were being treated in a manner that was similar to your Tea Party groups?
I have no knowledge of that, sir.
Mr. Hall, let me ask you. I understand that you were not assigned any of these progressive groups. Do you know who in the Washington Technical Unit was assigned these applications?
No, sir, I do not.
Do you have any information you can share with the committee about how such groups were screened or reviewed?
No, sir, I cannot.
According to Ranking Member Levin, who has been able to review the names of these categories of groups, key terms to search for these groups are included in the screening workshop trainings slideshow from July of 2010. It appears from that document that screeners were told to, and I quote, look for names like the ones for these groups, as well as for the terms progressive and Tea Party and Patriot and 9/12 Project. Certainly from this document, it appears that the Tea Party groups were not treated differently than progressive groups. Rather, they appear to be handled in a similar manner. Mr. Hall, do you agree that in order to determine whether a group has been singled out and treated differently than its peers, it is important to review how all similarly situated groups were handled?
I think that's above my grade level, sir. I wouldn't be able to comment on that.
All right. But to me, based on the evidence before us, the Inspector General's report did not tell us the full story of how the Internal Revenue Service handled applicants with political advocacy issues between 2010 and 2012. I hope that the reviews will provide relevant information and those corrections can be made. I thank you again both, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. We're now going to complete our as fast as we can, as many as we can, before we have to go to the vote. At this point, I show Dr. Desjardins as, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Meehan, if you please go next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for your perseverance today, both of the witnesses. And I have struggled just to sort of find out, as we continue to pursue what's happening with these Tea Party cases, I'd like to go back and put these things in a context. I'm just trying to find out at a baseline how cases were handled normally, Ms. Hoffaker, before Tea Party got put into your life. So first, you were working in a division that responsibility for you was to make decisions about people who were applicants for these 501c4 designations. Is that not accurate?
Yes, sir.
And in that period of time, you had to make decisions numerous times about the very characteristics that we've identified here that would include the possibility that some of it might be political activity and some of it may be advocacy for their activity, correct?
Sir, I worked cases that had all different activities. I worked 501c3s, all different tax-exempt codes.
And once you made those decisions, what did you have to do? When you made a conclusion that passed muster, what happened then?
Sir, we would have work papers and we would provide a summary of the case, use the appropriate law, and then come to some kind of conclusion. And then I would recommend approval to our manager, and then he would decide whether or not to sign off and approve the case.
And if your manager approved and signed off on the case, what happened then?
Well, if the case were not mandatory review, if the applicant would get exemption and they would get their letter. If it were mandatory review, it would go through another level.
What creates mandatory review?
Well, they can be manager designated. We have an internal revenue manual that designates numerous cases mandatory review.
And that's what happened with the Tea Party cases at one point in time?
It may have down the road after I left.
Okay, but normally you were able to make a recommendation. Your supervisor, presumably in Cincinnati, then approved it, and in the normal course of business, many of those cases then the exemption was granted and they went on their way.
That is correct.
Okay, when you were making those calculations, there were questions you asked. Who designed the questions?
Sir, the individual agent, myself, designed the questions based on the information typically in the file.
And once again, that was part of your analysis, but nobody else was looking at the questions that you were asking to make that calculation, were they?
Generally, that is correct.
Okay, now when you were assigned this special class of cases that were now going to seek approval, working on the Tea Party cases, is this the first time that you then had to automatically make sure that it went to EO technical?
Yes, sir, that would be correct.
Now, when you asked the questions at the outset, did you design that questionnaire?
Well, Mr. Hall had provided me copies of the letters he had sent to his applicants, And I used those and tailored them to my particular applicant's activities.
And Mr. Hull, did you design those to all of the questionnaires that were used in the applications for the Tea Party?
With regards to those, the two cases that were assigned to me,
Simply 2 cases.
2 cases,
Okay.
I prepared a letter asking for additional information from the organizations. No one reviewed it. I signed it.
Just a letter asking for additional
Just a
information?
letter asking for additional
How
information.
complex was that letter? Was it a lot of issues that were being asked for?
I don't recall the exact number of questions, but usually it wasn't more than a page of questions, or maybe a page and a half. It would
Okay,
depend on what the
page and a page and a half.
It would depend on the circumstances, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Hoffaker, did you get any other extensive questionnaires that were directed to you from Washington, D.C.?
No, I did not.
At that point in time, okay, you did not ask those questions, all right. When you forwarded these to Mr. Hull then, which was EO Technical, and it was your responsibility, Mr. Hull, to, in all of the cases or only in a few of these, to make decisions on the recommendations that were made by Mrs. Hoffaker with regard to Tea Parties?
In the beginning, when the first applications came in, there was a manager that overlooked it with me, and he decided at the end of the first group, he said he didn't need to see anymore. So I looked at all the questions that Ms. Hoffaker.
And that changed? How did it change and when did it change?
How did what's changed?
Well, he decided that he didn't need to see any more, so I'm presuming that you then made determinations, sent them back down to Cincinnati in the beginning, as you stated, with some of these cases, and that was the resolution, and it was either granted or appealed. Is that accurate?
I made suggestions to Ms. Hoffaker on these letters that were to be sent out for information.
And when did it change that there was a requirement for you not simply to send it back down to her with those recommendations, but that you had to send it to 2 other places, including Chief Counsel for resolution? I
had to send the cases to Chief Counsel to find out exactly what would be appropriate as far as they were concerned. At which point, when I finally learned what was appropriate, then I would be able to tell Ms. Hoffaker how she might want to tailor her questions.
Okay. Well,
If the gentleman could wrap up.
yes, I want to thank you. I was just simply asking about routine process. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney, who will complete this panel, and you will be excused following his questions.
And I'll do it quickly. Thank you. Just on the reform side of things, both of you had an extensive history with the agency, and we thank you for your service and your experience. But let me ask you to put that experience to work. Do you have any suggestions as to how this process might be speeded and made to run more smoothly and to resolve some of the issues that bring us here today?
I never thought about suggestions in that regard, sir.
I'm sorry?
I never thought about suggestions in that regard, sir, as to how it might go faster. It never occurred to me.
Okay. Ms. Hoffaker?
Sir, there are so many unknown variables and facets to a question like that. I'm not in a position to give an answer.
Okay. I only say it because, I mean, part of the problem seemed to be people thought they were getting delayed and delayed on that, and it seemed to be endemic to the entire system on that. So I didn't know if it was a lack of manpower, if it was a lack of clearer guidance, or what it might be. But if you haven't thought about it, then you haven't thought about it, and I thank you. I'll yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. That allows us to dismiss the panel. I want to thank you for your years of service, and I want to thank you for your patience with, if you will, and I'm not trying to be unkind, but we know you were asked the same questions over and over again. We know you heard the same speeches over and over again. But you have moved us in a decisive way toward our next level of investigation, and I do not expect to ask you to come back. I do expect you to enjoy your retirement, Mr. Hull, and Liz Hoffaker. I hope your career is as long as you want to have it. Something tells me it may not be 48 years, but hopefully we have not diminished your confidence in Congress. Mr. Cummings.
I'll be very brief. I, too, want to thank both of you for your service. I want to thank you for being here. Ms. Hoffaker, I got to tell you, one of the most painful things that I've heard since I've been here is when you said that there was some threats or whatever to you and your family. You know, that is totally unfortunate. If there's anything that we can do, and I know the chairman joins me in that, and all our members, we want to make sure that we do what we can to to help you. And again, to you, Mr. Hall, thank you very much. And your testimony has been quite helpful. Thank you.
We stand, we
thank
stand,
you, sir.
we stand recessed for the next panel.
Let's hope.
Thank you, guys.